What's up, AP Psych? This is your cognitive and communication development lecture. This is a little bit of a two for one again, just like the last one, but the communication development section is really small. Given all of this, I don't know, this might actually split into two lectures. I'm going to get right into it and we'll see how it goes. A ton of learning targets in regards to cognitive development, and then a handful in regards to language and communication. We're going to dive right in with Piaget's stages of cognitive development. Jean Piaget is one of the most famous psychologists ever, American psychologists ever, I should say. Time magazine called him one of the 20th century's 20 most influential scientists and thinkers. And so his ideas were highly well regarded, highly popular, though not beyond critique. And he basically said, he specialized in development and child development, and he said that children develop as they interact with physical experiences. So his theory is a discontinuous stage theory, meaning that knowledge is constructed basically in spurts as the brain is ready for it. His his theory, as you see as we will go on, focuses on the order of stages really specifically. That might sound a little bit confusing, but you'll see what I mean in just a moment. One foundational Piaget idea is that children build schemas as they encounter new information. And if you recall, I defined schemas in a previous lecture in a previous unit as a list of characteristics that help us fit an object into one concept versus another. In other words, we continuously develop frameworks that organize and interpret new information. And children specifically, according to Piaget, do it either through assimilation or accommodation. Assimilation is when you fit new information into an existing schema. So let's say you encounter a zebra. You are likely to put that into your schema of a horse. They seem to fit together. That's assimilating new information into something you already know. But accommodation is when you would perhaps develop new schemas for each animal separately. So changing your understanding of an existing schema to possibly include new information or maybe develop a whole new schema altogether. In modern understanding, this is considered both a continuous and discontinuous process, meaning we slowly, gradually develop our schemas, but we also sometimes have kind of an intense level up of our knowledge base or cognition as our brains are ready for it. Oh, together, assimilation and accommodation, we consider an adaptation process, a way that we humans adapt to new cognition, new information, things of that nature. Okay, Piaget had 4 stages of development: sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. And we're going to go through each one. Each one pertains to a certain age group and cognitive abilities. In the sensory motor stage, this is the stages between 0 and 2, the stage that most children are in between 0 and 2 years old, so until about toddler age, where they experience the world mostly with their 5 senses. Things like what they can put in their mouth, what they can grab, what they can smell, what they can touch. Okay. They at this stage they are working on developing their sense of object permanence. So basically, they think that if they can't see something because they close their eyes, or they can't see something because they cover it up, that thing is gone entirely. So that's why they get such a kick out of peekaboo. They also have, but will slowly lose that sense of stranger anxiety. This is not stranger danger, like being taught to not talk to strangers. This is seeing a brand new face that doesn't fit into your schema, that's not familiar, and freaking out. Or, in other words, a fear of strangers. And this should make sense because if we develop everything based on schemas, the idea is that we only have schemas for certain familiar faces. And when they don't fit into that idea, a young child doesn't know what to do with it. So we find that children react very warmly and kindly to those faces that they recognize and not to those that are strangers. This big black box here just indicates a video that we will watch in class. The next stage is the pre-operational stage, which Piaget said ranged from age 2 to age 7. Now, with this stage, with all the stages, but with this one in particular, it is defined by both what a child can do and what they can't do, and recognize that some of these things, 2 to 7 is a pretty significant time frame, that they might enter the stage not being able to do something at 2 years old, 3 years old, but they also might be working on developing one of these characteristics I'm about to tell you by the time that they're 7 years old. Okay. At this stage, one overall statement we can make is that children learn to represent things with words, images, or in other words, symbolic thinking, using pictures and words to stand for something in real life, and that there's a huge emphasis on playing pretend and using your imagination. Children of this age exhibit three cognitive skills that we need to know. More than this, but three that we need to know. First of all, egocentrism. This is when they can only perceive things from their own point of view. This is not being egotistical. It's not about being selfish, but that they can only explain things from their own sense of sight or what they are feeling or what they are thinking, or from their own point of view. Like perhaps with a sibling, they recognize that the lady in the house is their mom, but not maybe their sibling's mom. They can only understand it from their side. More on this in class. They also exhibit animism and the belief that an inanimate object would have life-like qualities, like when it rains, the sky is crying, or that the dolly is actually their baby, things like that. But it can also be as much as like if you pull the grass out of the ground, that the grass is like sad, it hurts, you just pulled it apart. And then they also start to see ideas, we also start to see ideas of theory of mind. This is a slowly emerging skill, and it's the ability to understand somebody else's mental state and realize that they may be different, or their mental state might be different than yours, and that it helps predict the behavior of others. So perhaps as a child, if you think it's funny to kick and hit someone else, you might think that your theory of mind is going to expect them to also think it's funny. And you might not be able to understand or even predict that if I play bad guy and I punch my brother or sister or friend or something, that they actually might get upset about it. So this is something that young children don't have, but then start to show evidence of it as they are in this stage. Pre-operationally aged children also lack certain cognitive skills. They do not have a concept of conservation or reversibility. So conservation meaning that the quantity is the same even if shape or other properties change. So if you take a tall skinny water bottle of 8 ounces and you pour it into a short wide cup that still holds 8 ounces, you're going to think that the one in the short cup is less. The child's not going to understand that even though they're a different shape, that they're actually the same quantity. They're going to see things as tall or flat, big or skinny, that sorts of thing. Or that if you cut up a pizza in 10 slices instead of 6 slices, how maybe 2 of those slices could equal one of the 6. So again, I'll demonstrate with some visuals and a little video in class to make this make more sense. They also struggle with the concept of reversibility, that actions, thoughts, or things can be reversed or undone back to their original state. Again, if you take that bottle and you pour it into a cup, they're not going to be able to understand that that cup of liquid could go back into the bottle. Or it could be something in terms of like math, that 4 plus 8 equals 12, but if you have 12 and you take away 8, that it equals 4. That's much too complicated for someone in the pre-operational cognitive stage. Next is the concrete operational stage, which is kind of the older child stage. This is where a little young human, develops the ability to think in a more logical, realistic way. They are capable of rational and spatial interpretations. They enjoy hands-on experiences. They understand analogies, master those conservation and reversibility errors that they made when they were younger, and yet they struggle with systematic thinking, things like making and carrying out a plan. So in the immediate present, they can problem solve, be logical, be realistic, but anything long term, they might have trouble understanding how to achieve their goals. And then Piaget's fourth and final stage is the formal operational stage, which he says most people 12 and up are capable of, but that this is where someone can think abstractly, hypothetically. This is where they start to play around with moral reasoning and ethical issues. They approach problems systematically and apply one concept to another. They are also capable of deductive reasoning, going from general to specific conclusions. For example, perhaps you could say, if all dogs are mammals, then this my dog Spot must be a mammal. So if this is happening, then this general statement that I can make, I can draw a conclusion to a more specific example of information. But Piaget also concluded that not all people get here. Just because you're over 12 years old, this is pretty high level advanced critical thinking, and perhaps not everybody, even well into adulthood, is going to reach this sort of cognitive ability. Piaget's theories have also faced a lot of criticism over the years, that perhaps he was too rigid in his stage idea, that maybe more people do develop gradually, but some might go faster than others. And so his stages were almost too rigid, and that human ability is much more diverse than this. Lev Vygotsky is kind of the not exactly the opposite, but the counterpart to Piaget's ideas, because he believed much more in continuous development. His theory was based on something called the zone of proximal development, which I'll talk about in a minute. But he believed that children develop as they interact with sociocultural experiences. So instead of trying things with the physical world, like just seeing what happens when you throw a rock through a window, that most of our learning was based on observation or working closely with mentors or support. So his focus was continuous because he focused on gradual learning. And he believed that children learn best in the zone of proximal development, what we are going to call ZPD. And he believed that the best learning occurred in a zone between too easy and too hard. That basically a child could do something cognitively with help and with something called scaffolding. So, kind of like a framework to support children as they develop higher levels of thinking. For example, your guided notes are a form of scaffolding that I've chosen to use. I give you structure, so you kind of get into a routine of what's important and what's not important, how to use short phrases, and that ideally, eventually on your own, you could probably take similar notes simply by listening. So the ZPD works because even though, so the child feels a little bit challenged but not overwhelmed that they want to quit, that they have help or someone to observe them or just jump in when they get stuck, and that by doing that, they will learn more and more, and that zone of proximal development will continuously grow. Both Piaget and Vygotsky understood that cognition continues to develop into adulthood, but their theories mostly focused on children and adolescents. As for adult cognition, we already know that there is some decline in intellectual functioning. We know from previous lectures that fluid intelligence declines. That's the idea of being able to process and reason quickly, solve problems, make decisions quickly. That sort of drops off as we age. Not sort of, it does drop off as we age. But crystallized intelligence remains steady or even increases over time. We also know that it takes older adults longer to process memories. Recall declines, but recognition generally does not, meaning they might have a hard time coming up with a memory out of thin air or information out of the blue, so to speak. But when given a prompt or a cue or a hint, recognition generally is no problem. Not on here, but a side note, we also know that sometimes episodic memories, like telling a story of the past, might be harder and harder to grasp, especially recent stories of the past, which I know sounds funny because there's so much interference. You have so many memories, it can be harder to come up with the more recent ones because you have so many stories piled into your memory. We also know that if a person stays physically and mentally active, memory loss is almost non existent, but sometimes memory loss is inevitable, especially if one develops a disease like Alzheimer's disease or dementia. By 80 years old, we know that in general, neural processing does slow down, especially for complex tasks. And just can we give it up to my Mima on her 90th birthday? She's been gone for quite a while now, but this is a fond memory. And, you know, love that lady. Love her. And I hope I can make it to 90 years old. Okay, let's shift gears to communication development. This is still sort of in the idea of cognitive development because we need cognition and we often have voices in our head, but we need cognition to help us understand communication and communicate ourselves. But let's start by simply defining language. Language is the spoken, written, or gestured word, so it can be words or nonverbals, that allow an infinity of ideas to be communicated. So that how can we get to a point where we can communicate our thoughts and feelings, facts, all sorts of things with no limits whatsoever? I'm going to give you a mouthful of a sentence here. Language is also defined as a shared, mutually agreed upon system of arbitrary symbols, letters, phonemes, morphemes, I'll tell you what those are shortly, that are rule governed via grammar and syntax and semantics to create as many ideas as a person wants to communicate. Woo, that was a lot. We're going to break that down item by item. I'm going to start with the structure of language. Of course, we know that you need to learn letters, how to draw them, what sounds they make, and things like that. But those basic parts of our language are phonemes and morphemes. Phonemes are the smallest distinctive sound unit in a spoken language. In other words, you might have called this when you were little phonics. So, for example, in the word bat, boet, that's three phonemes because each letter makes its own sound. But then in chat, it goes ch, at, also three phonemes, but the C and the H blend to make a different sound. So it's not necessarily letter by letter, it's sound chunk by sound chunk. Morphemes, on the other hand, are the smallest unit that carry meaning. So how can you break a word down into words or chunks that also convey a meaning? The word milk, just as milk. You can't break that down. You can break it down into phonemes, but morphemes, you can't break it down into anything else meaningful. A pumpkin can actually be broken down into two word chunks, pump and kin. Now, they don't necessarily have meaning individually. Their individual meanings don't match their collective meaning of this object right here, but individually they sure do. We also might call a morpheme like a prefix or suffix, especially if it's adding something like un or ing or ed or s. So these sounds that make things past tense, present tense, plurals, undos, things like that. We'll see a few more examples as we go. Grammar is a system of rules in a language that enables us to communicate with and understand others. So good for us. We have the sounds down, we have words down, but we need grammar to help us understand both syntax, which is basically the order of words, and semantics, which is the meaning of words. We're going to get into this a little bit more, including what surface and deep mean. Syntax are specifically a set of rules for the order of words into sentences. We consider this the surface structure, just basically what sounds right, what makes sense. In English, for example, we know that adjectives come before nouns, things like white house, but in Spanish, that is a reverse rule like casa blanca. We also should know the word semantics already, but we also rely on semantics to help us understand language. And we know semantics to be a set of rules to derive meaning from sounds. So syntax is like the basic order of words. Semantics is getting at what is the meaning of words or sentences when they're put together. It involves the use of morphemes at times. We call this deep structure. Surface is what's the order, what should it look like? Deep structure is what does it mean? So for example, we can add the morpheme of ed to the word laugh to mean left, as in the past tense. So morpheme changes the meaning or the semantics of the word. Now, how and when does language develop? Well, language develops in what we call a critical period. I don't exactly have a definition here, but I'm going to say it out loud. A critical period is the idea of something that needs to develop in a certain age range, or it might not ever develop at all. We know this to be true for language and attachment in relationships, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. So the critical period for language is that you must be exposed to and practice and start to learn before age 7, or you are likely not master it at all. Unfortunately, we do have some famous cases of child abuse where children were not allowed to interact with anyone else and were isolated until one specific famous case study that I'm thinking of, a girl I believe was isolated until she was maybe 9 years old, and she never really learned how to speak because she never learned it before the age of 7. We know that children can comprehend receptive language before producing it themselves, so they can understand what is said to them and about them before they can actually talk back. And we know that this is key. Language development is key to developing symbolic thinking. You can't understand that the word food means food if you don't have food in front of you until you can develop symbolic thinking. We also know that children who talk to themselves develop the ability to control their behaviors and emotions by kind of talking themselves through rules and cautions or encouragement and motivational statements. And talking to themselves helps develop new skills and use their imagination. I don't think this needs further explanation. I think you can understand pretty clearly by talking to yourself what it is I'm getting at. And then just kind of generically, I guess I threw this in here. We know that language also includes nonverbal manual gestures that sometimes cross cultures and age groups. Like we all know, if you point, no matter how old you are or where you are in the world, we know what pointing means. Okay, almost done. How or in what order or what happens and how do we develop our ability to speak? Can I speak right now? I don't know. This is getting to be a long lecture. I'm having trouble. But okay, we know that language starts to develop around 4 months years old. Language is hard, y'all. Okay, around 4 months old, babies start to make spontaneous sounds. Sounds like ah, goo, bah. And sometimes we fool ourselves into thinking that they're actually trying to communicate something or that it means things like mama or dada, but that's a little early for that. Usually by 9 or 10 months old, the sounds that they make can be identified as either English, Spanish, French, or whatever it is that is the baby's native language. By approximately 1 year old, we do start to hear words like dada, mama, and at 1 year old, they are in the one word stage. We know that the words carry meaning, or the child knows that words carry meaning, and they can start speaking one word thoughts. Like they might say doggy, but what they really mean is look at that dog there. The two-word stage develops around 2 years old. Sometimes this is called telegraphic speech because it's very, very choppy and they only use key words. And so a child speaks like a telegram. Go car might mean I want to go for a ride in the car. And then finally, older children, usually around the age of late 3, early 4, can speak in complex sentences with syntactical sense. In other words, they learn how to put words in order. Why don't we just say that? I don't know. Like, mommy, get ball. We also know that older children are starting to understand humor, like the joke, you never starve in the desert because of all the sand, which is there. Sandwiches. Get it? Get it? But we also know that older children still make common errors like overgeneralization of grammar rules. So this is when a child applies a grammar rule too broadly. So if they know that ed goes on the end of the word for past tense, they might say I goed to the store, or perhaps for the s plural, there are 20 childs in class. So they understand grammar and complex sentences, but they still tend to make some rules here or there. Okay, I apologize for this one being a smidge on the long side, but I think it makes more sense than doing like a 20-minute and a 5-minute video. So thank you for sticking with me, and I hope you learned a lot.